remember when I first heard about Mike's disappearance. It's not like we were close or anything, but you notice things when you've lived in the same neighborhood for years. We'd wave when passing each other on the street, exchange a few awkward words about the weather, that kind of thing. He was a quiet guy, didn't really hang out with the neighbors, but still, something about him stuck out. Not in a bad way, just different. He always had this tired look in his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He worked nights, I think, so maybe that was it. Who knows? Anyway, it was just another day until he wasn't around anymore. At first, I didn't really care much. People move away all the time without saying anything. I figured he just up and left. But when his car stayed parked on the street for days and his trash cans weren't brought in from the curb, that's when people started to ask questions. The weirdest part? His house was still locked up tight. No one saw him leave. The lights would turn on at night, the TV flickered through the windows, and then nothing. No more Mike. A couple of weeks passed before the cops got involved. They knocked on doors, asked a few questions, but no one had answers. That's when I started getting curious. I don't know why I was so obsessed with it. I guess a part of me felt like something wasn't right. Mike didn't seem like the kind of guy to just vanish. I mean, who would? The whole thing felt wrong. The cops didn't find anything. They ruled it as just a missing person case and left it at that. But something kept nagging at me. You know how you get that gut feeling like something's off, but you can't put your finger on it? Yeah, that was me. The nights got quieter. People stopped talking about him. It's like everyone just decided to move on, pretend like it didn't happen, but not me. That's when I made my first mistake. I couldn't let it go. I've always been a tech geek. A little too good with computers for my own good, I guess. A few years ago, I'd messed around with the dark web, just out of curiosity. Never bought anything, never did anything illegal, but I knew my way around. It was like this nasty corner of the internet that most people don't even realize exists, and that's where I found him. I didn't mean to look for Mike, not really. I was just browsing out of boredom, checking out the different forums and markets when I came across something that made my stomach turn. There's this dark web marketplace that sells people. I know it sounds insane, but it's real. Most of the listings are vague, just descriptions with cryptic titles and a few images. People looking to buy slaves, human trafficking, all the worst shit you can imagine. But one of the listings was different. The listing was titled, "Local Boy, Quiet, Ready for Transport." It was one of those things where you read it, and your brain doesn't fully process it right away. I clicked on it, not thinking anything would come of it, maybe expecting it to be some sick joke. But when the page loaded, I felt like I was going to throw up. There was a photo, and it was Mike. He was sitting in this dirty-looking room, tied to a chair. His face was swollen and bruised, and he was staring blankly at the camera. The worst part? His eyes. They didn't even look like him anymore. They were dull, lifeless, like he'd given up. The caption under the image read, "Unclaimed, good condition, $20,000. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands shaking, not really understanding what I was seeing. It was one of those moments where your brain tries to protect you from the truth. I tried convincing myself it wasn't him. Maybe it was someone who looked like him. Maybe it was all just some kind of fucked up scam. But deep down, I knew. It was Mike. I clicked through the listing, hoping there was something that would prove it wasn't real, but the more I looked, the worse it got. There were other photos, all of them with different angles. In some, Mike was unconscious, slumped over in the chair. In others, he was awake, but clearly out of it, like they'd drugged him. His arms and legs were bound, and there were deep, raw marks on his wrists where he'd struggled against the ropes. There was even a video, but I couldn't bring myself to click on it. Just the thought of what might be in that video made me feel sick. I closed my laptop and sat there in the dark, trying to process everything. This couldn't be happening. Things like this don't happen in real life, right? People don't just get sold like cattle. But there he was, my neighbor, a guy I'd waved to on the street, being auctioned off like some kind of object.
For a while I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to figure out what to do. Should I go to the police? Show them the website? But then I thought, what if they didn't believe me? It's the dark web after all. They might think I was making it up, or worse, that I was involved somehow. I didn't know what to do. I felt helpless. And then that gut feeling hit me again. Someone had to be responsible for this. Someone in the neighborhood, maybe. How else would they know Mike so well? I spent the rest of the night in a paranoid haze. Every noise outside my window made me jump. Every passing car made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like whoever took Mike might know I'd found him. And then there was this awful thought creeping in the back of my mind. What if I'm next? I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I was a mess. I called in sick to work and sat in front of my computer, staring at the dark web marketplace, refreshing the page over and over, hoping that maybe the listing would disappear. But it didn't. It was still there, the price still set at $20,000, like Mike was nothing more than a piece of meat waiting to be sold. That's when I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to disappear forever. But I didn't know where to start. Should I contact the seller? Try to buy him myself? The whole thing felt so surreal, like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't act fast, Mike was going to disappear for good, and I'd be stuck living with the knowledge that I did nothing to stop it. I barely made it through the day after finding that listing. My mind was a mess. I kept replaying Mike's face in my head, those dead, hollow eyes. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to act fast. Every second I wasted felt like one step closer to him being sold, shipped off to God knows where. I couldn't let that happen.
So, I did the only thing that seemed logical at the time. I contacted the seller. Yeah, I know it sounds insane, but I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I figured if I could talk to them, maybe I could delay things, or at least figure out where they were holding him. The dark web's not like normal internet browsing. You don't just message someone and hope for a quick response. It's all anonymous, coded, and sketchy as hell. I sent a message to the seller through the marketplace, acting like a potential buyer. It was a simple message. Is the product still available? I was hoping they wouldn't respond, that maybe the whole thing was some elaborate scam, but within an hour I got a reply. The response was short, cold, and it made my stomach churn. Yes, pickup or delivery. My hands were shaking as I read the words. Pickup or delivery, like Mike was just some package. I felt a wave of anger and disgust wash over me, but I kept my cool. I knew I had to play along if I wanted any chance of figuring out where they were keeping him. I messaged back, asking for more details. The conversation moved fast after that, too fast for my liking. The seller wasn't interested in small talk or answering questions. They just wanted to finalize the deal. I asked for more pictures of the product, hoping to stall them, maybe even get a clue about the location. They sent more images without hesitation. The new pictures made me sick to my core. In one of the photos, Mike was tied to a filthy mattress, his face turned away from the camera. His clothes were ripped, and I could see bruises covering his arms and legs, like someone had beaten him repeatedly. Another picture showed his back, bloodied, raw, with deep gashes like someone had taken a knife to him. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart raced, my palms sweaty as I clicked through the images. The final one was the worst. It was a close-up of his face. He was awake, barely. His mouth was gagged, his eyes wide with fear, and something else, something I can't even describe. It wasn't just fear. It was like he knew he wasn't getting out of this, like he'd accepted it. That image burned itself into my brain. Every time I blinked, I saw his face. I almost wanted to smash my computer, but I couldn't. I had to keep going. I forced myself to keep typing, trying to keep up the act. I asked where the pickup would be, pretending I was interested in handling it myself. I didn't even know what I'd do if they gave me an address. bust in there on my own. I wasn't thinking straight. The response came quickly. Local pickup can be arranged. 48 hours to confirm payment. 2 days. I had 2 fucking days before Mike would disappear. That's when I realized how deep I was getting. This wasn't just some sick fantasy on the internet. This was real. People like this existed, and they were organized. They had systems, rules, deadlines, and if I didn't act, Mike was gone forever. I tried to keep the conversation going, asking more questions, pretending I needed time to secure the payment. I was hoping to trick them into slipping up, maybe giving me more information, but the seller was cold, calculated. They didn't care about my questions, only the money. Then, something happened that shook me to my core. They sent me an address. Cash delivery. Meet at this location tomorrow, 10 p.m., don't be late. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe it. They actually gave me an address, a real physical location. It wasn't far, maybe 30 minutes from my house. An abandoned building near the outskirts of town. I knew the place. It used to be an old factory that shut down years ago, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. At this point, I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have gone to the police. I should have told someone, anyone, but I didn't. I didn't trust anyone to believe me, and I was too scared to involve them. So I made a decision, a really stupid one looking back. I decided I was going to that building. Alone. I spent the next day in a fog, barely able to function. Every minute that passed felt like a countdown to something horrible. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat, couldn't even think straight. All I could see in my mind was Mike's beaten, broken face, and that damned address burned into my brain. When night fell, I grabbed my car keys and drove out to the location. My hands were slick with sweat, and my stomach was twisted in knots. The road out there was deserted, just long stretches of nothing with the occasional rundown building. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me, watching me. When I pulled up to the factory, I nearly turned back. The place was pitch black, no lights, no sign of life. Just a crumbling old building standing against the night sky. I parked a little way down the road and approached on foot, trying to keep my breathing steady, but every step felt like a death march. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There were cars parked around the back, 3 of them. And they weren't just any cars, these were black, unmarked vans, the kind that screamed trouble. I ducked behind some rusted-out metal drums and tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do. I couldn't just waltz in there. I didn't have a weapon, didn't have any backup. What was I thinking? But then I heard it, the sound of voices, muffled but close. I crouched down and crept along the side of the building, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My heart was racing, my mouth dry. The voices were coming from inside. I could hear footsteps too, heavy boots on concrete, like people were moving around. And then I saw him. Through a crack in one of the broken windows, I caught a glimpse of Mike. He was inside, slumped against a wall, barely conscious. His face was swollen, covered in dried blood. They had him tied up, just like in the pictures. But what really messed me up was what I saw next. There were 3 men in the room with him. 2 of them were talking. One was pacing back and forth like he was agitated. The third guy, he was sharpening a knife. Not a small knife either. This was one of those long, curved blades, the kind that's made for cutting deep. He was standing over Mike, running the blade along his leg, teasing him like he was some kind of animal. I felt my blood run cold. I was too late. Whatever they were going to do to Mike, it wasn't going to be quick. And then one of the men said something that made me freeze. "He's next. We'll list him tomorrow." He's next? What the fuck did that mean? Were there more people? More victims? The thought made my skin crawl. I had to do something. But what? I wasn't a hero. I wasn't prepared for any of this. But I couldn't just sit there and watch. That's when I made my second mistake. I took out my phone to record it. When I pulled out my phone, my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I fumbled with the camera app, trying to steady myself. I knew I needed proof, something solid to take to the police. Without it, no one would believe me. The whole situation felt like a fever dream, like something straight out of a horror movie, but this was real. Mike was real. And those men inside the building, they were real too. I aimed my phone through the crack in the broken window, trying to get a clear shot of Mike and the men. It wasn't easy. The angle was terrible, and the low light made it hard to see anything. I zoomed in, praying the footage would be clear enough. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I felt like I was running out of time. As I recorded, I could hear bits of their conversation. The man sharpening the knife, he was the one in charge, the one giving orders. His voice was low, gravelly, like he'd smoked 2 packs a day for 20 years. He kept talking about the product, using the same cold, detached language as the seller on the dark web. They didn't even see Mike as a person. To them, he was just an object, a piece of inventory waiting to be shipped. The other 2 guys were younger, maybe in their 20s. One of them had this sick grin on his face, like he was enjoying it, enjoying the fact that they had complete control over another human being. The other one, though, there was something off about him. He kept glancing at Mike, shifting uncomfortably, like maybe he didn't want to be there. Maybe he wasn't fully on board with whatever was about to happen. But he wasn't stopping it either. I zoomed in closer, focusing on Mike's face. His eyes were half closed, bloodshot, like he was barely hanging on. He was breathing, but just barely. I could see the rise and fall of his chest, slow and shallow. I didn't know how much longer he had. Every second that passed felt like it could be his last. Then, something terrible happened. In my panic, I forgot to turn off the sound on my phone. As I was recording, I accidentally hit the volume button, and this loud click echoed in the silence. My heart stopped. One of the guys, the one pacing, snapped his head toward the window, his eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness outside. I ducked down, holding my breath, praying he hadn't seen me. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but I was frozen in place. The fear was paralyzing. I heard footsteps coming toward the window, heavy, deliberate steps. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was crouched behind the metal drums, hoping, praying that he wouldn't come outside. But the footsteps kept getting closer, until I heard him right on the other side of the wall. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just a few feet away from me. I could hear him breathing, slow and steady, like he was listening for something. I held my breath, pressing myself against the cold metal, trying to make myself as small as possible. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Then, without warning, the guy smashed his fist against the window, shattering what little glass was left. I flinched, biting down hard on my lip to keep from making any noise. I could taste blood in my mouth, but I didn't move. I didn't dare. After a few agonizing moments, I heard him mutter something under his breath and walk away. His footsteps faded back into the building, and I finally exhaled. But my relief was short-lived. I knew I had to get out of there. My phone was still recording, but I didn't have time to check if I'd gotten anything useful. I couldn't risk staying any longer. They were already suspicious, and if they caught me, I didn't want to think about what would happen. I had to move. Now. I crept away from the building, keeping low, staying in the shadows. Every step felt like it was too loud, like they could hear me even though I was trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart was racing, my throat dry. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see one of them come after me. But the yard behind the factory stayed empty. I made it back to my car, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The second the engine roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas and sped out of there. My hands were slick with sweat, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting one of those black vans to be following me, but there was nothing. Just darkness. When I got home, I parked the car in the driveway and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My mind was racing, my body trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd been this close to getting caught. And if I had been, I don't even want to think about it. After a few deep breaths, I pulled out my phone and checked the footage. My heart sank. The video was grainy, shaky, almost impossible to make out. You could see Mike, sure, but the angle was terrible, and the lighting made it hard to tell what was happening. The audio was worse. All you could hear was muffled talking, nothing clear enough to prove what they were doing. It wasn't enough. I wanted to scream. All that risk, and I still had nothing solid. But then, I noticed something in the background of the video. Something small, but important. On the wall behind Mike, there was a logo. It was faint, almost hidden behind layers of grime and dirt, but it was there. A faded company logo, probably from when the factory was still in business. It was the name of a shipping company. I didn't recognize it at first, but a quick search online told me everything I needed to know. The company had gone out of business years ago, but their trucks were still in circulation. And guess who owned a few of those trucks? The same assholes who were selling people on the dark web. That's when it clicked. These guys weren't just some random kidnappers. They were part of something bigger, a network, a whole fucking operation. They were using old, abandoned properties to store their inventory before shipping them off to buyers. And the shipping company? That was their cover. Suddenly, it all made sense. The vans, the factory, the dark web listings, it was all connected. And now, I had a lead. I didn't know where it would take me, but it was something. I wasn't going to let Mike disappear without a fight. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mike's face, that beaten, broken face, and those guys with the knife, sharpening it, getting ready for whatever sick shit they had planned. I couldn't let it happen. I spent the rest of the night researching, digging into the company, the property, anything I could find. The more I learned, the more I realized just how deep this went, and the deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. But I didn't care. I was in too deep already. There was no turning back now. I couldn't stop. Once I had that lead, once I saw the logo on the wall behind Mike, I knew I was onto something bigger than I ever imagined. This wasn't just some freaks in an abandoned building torturing a guy for fun. No, this was organized, professional. The more I dug, the more connections I found, and with every new piece of information, the pit in my stomach grew deeper. I started with the shipping company. The name was old, like I said, but it wasn't completely dead. A few trucks were still registered under the company's name, and from what I could gather, they were still in use. But the company itself had shut down years ago after going bankrupt. So why were their trucks still out there, driving around like nothing had changed? Something didn't add up. I spent hours scouring the internet for anything I could find, going through forums, news articles, anything that mentioned the company. And then I hit gold. Well, if you can call it that. I found a post on a forum, one of those sketchy, hidden forums you can only access if you know where to look. The post was about the company, and it was written by someone who claimed to have worked for them before they went under. They talked about how the company had gone bankrupt, but the trucks were sold off to private buyers. Except, the thing was, those buyers weren't legit. They were fronts for something much darker. According to the post, the trucks were being used to transport cargo, human cargo, and not just in my town. This shit was happening everywhere. Cities, small towns, even rural areas. They'd grab people, sometimes locals, sometimes drifters, and ship them off to whoever had the money to pay. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Mike wasn't the first. Hell, he wasn't even the only one in my area. This was a whole fucking operation, and people were just disappearing, getting sucked into this black hole of human trafficking, never to be seen again. And the worst part? No one knew. No one cared. I kept digging, going down this rabbit hole that seemed to have no end. The deeper I went, the more disturbing it got. The forum posts led to more forums, more stories of people who'd gone missing, never to be found. All of them had one thing in common. the shipping trucks. At this point, I was running on pure adrenaline. I barely ate, barely slept. My life had become this twisted obsession with finding out what had happened to Mike, and now I realized I wasn't just trying to save him. I was trying to stop something far bigger than I could handle. I knew I needed help, but who the hell was I supposed to turn to? The cops. They wouldn't believe a word of it. I couldn't just waltz into the station and say, "Hey, I think there's a human trafficking ring using old shipping trucks to kidnap people and sell them on the dark web." They'd laugh me out of the building, or worse, they'd think I was in on it. No, I had to do this on my own. I didn't have a choice. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If I was going to take these guys down, I needed to catch them in the act. I needed to follow the trucks, see where they were going, see who they were delivering to. But that meant getting close to them again, risking everything. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The following night, I parked outside the factory again. This time, I brought binoculars and a better camera, hoping to get something more useful. I knew the vans would show up eventually. They were too organized to leave Mike there for long. They had a schedule, a system, and just like clockwork, the black vans pulled in, right around midnight. I watched from my car, parked a block away, hidden in the shadows. The factory was quiet at first, just the sound of the wind howling through the empty streets. But then I saw movement. 3 guys got out of the vans, the same ones from before. They weren't carrying anything at first, just walking around, talking to each other. I couldn't hear what they were saying from where I was, but I didn't need to. I already knew their plan. Then they went inside, and that's when shit got real. About 10 minutes later, they came out, dragging Mike with them. He was barely conscious, just a limp body in their arms. His face looked even worse than before, bruised and swollen. His shirt was stained with blood, and his wrists were tied with thick rope. They tossed him into the back of one of the vans like he was nothing, just dead weight to them. I watched in horror as they slammed the doors shut and started the engine. I knew this was my chance. I had to follow them, see where they were taking him. It was the only way I could figure out where they were holding the other victims, if there were others. My hands were slick with sweat as I started my car and followed the vans at a distance. I kept my headlights off, staying far enough behind that they wouldn't notice me. The roads were dark, empty, which only made the whole thing feel even more surreal. I kept expecting them to pull over to spot me tailing them, but they didn't. They drove for what felt like hours, taking back roads, avoiding the main highways. It was almost like they knew someone might be watching. Eventually, they pulled into a secluded area, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, one I'd never seen before. There were no streetlights, no cameras, nothing, just darkness and silence. I parked my car a good distance away and crept up on foot, hiding behind a row of rusted-out shipping containers. My heart was pounding in my chest, every beat loud in the still night air. I could see them unloading Mike from the van, dragging him inside the warehouse. I knew I didn't have much time. I needed to get inside, needed to see what they were doing. I made my way around the side of the building, trying to find a way in without being seen. There were no windows, no obvious entry points, except for a side door that was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The place reeked of death. It wasn't just the smell of rot or decay, it was the feeling in the air. Something awful had happened here, was happening here. The kind of place where people disappeared, where screams went unheard. I crept down a narrow hallway, the sound of my footsteps barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, voices, low, hushed voices, coming from just up ahead. I pressed myself against the wall, inching forward until I could see into the main room. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. There were more people than just Mike. 5, maybe 6 others, all tied up, gagged, and barely alive. They were laid out on the cold concrete floor like animals, their faces swollen, their bodies covered in cuts and bruises. Some of them were barely conscious, their eyes glazed over from whatever hell they'd been through. And in the center of the room, standing over them, was the man with the knife. He was talking to the others, giving orders, pointing to each victim like they were inventory. They were deciding who would go next, who would be shipped out first. I felt sick. My stomach turned as I realized what I was witnessing. This wasn't just a holding area. This was a fucking auction. They were selling these people right here, right now, deciding their fates like they were nothing more than cattle. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the men pointed at Mike, and the guy with the knife nodded. He stepped forward, raising the blade. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and watch as they butchered him. But what the hell was I supposed to do? I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. I was just one guy, completely out of my depth. But I couldn't let Mike die like that. Not after everything I'd seen. Before I could think it through, I made my move. I grabbed a piece of scrap metal off the floor, a rusty old pipe, and charged into the room, swinging it with all the strength I had left. I don't know what I was thinking when I charged in there. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. Maybe it was pure instinct, fight or flight. All I knew was that I couldn't let Mike die in front of me. The second I burst into the room, everything slowed down, like some kind of sick nightmare that wouldn't end. The rusty pipe felt heavier in my hands than I expected. My palms were slick with sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. I saw the guy with the knife first. He was standing over Mike, his arm raised, ready to bring the blade down. There was no time to hesitate. I swung the pipe with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud against the guy's head, and he dropped like a sack of bricks. The knife clattered to the ground, spinning away from his limp hand. For a split second, I thought I'd done it. I thought I'd saved Mike. But I hadn't. The other two guys reacted instantly. One of them lunged at me before I could even process what was happening. His hands wrapped around my throat, squeezing hard enough that I felt my vision blur. I tried to swing the pipe again, but he was too fast. He slammed me against the wall, knocking the air out of my lungs. I gasped, struggling to breathe, my world narrowing down to his hands, choking the life out of me. Somehow, I managed to jab my elbow into his ribs. He grunted, loosening his grip just enough for me to push him off. I swung the pipe again, hitting him in the knee. He crumpled to the floor, screaming in pain. But before I could catch my breath, the third guy was on me. This one was bigger, stronger. He grabbed me by the collar and threw me to the ground like I weighed nothing. My head hit the concrete hard, and for a moment I saw stars. Everything spun. I could hear Mike groaning in the background, but I couldn't focus. My head felt like it was splitting open, the room spinning around me in slow motion. The guy kicked me in the stomach, once, twice, knocking the wind out of me. I curled up, gasping for air, but he didn't stop. He kicked me again, this time in the ribs. I felt something crack, pain exploding through my body. I tried to crawl away, but he grabbed me by the leg and dragged me back. I could taste blood in my mouth, the metallic tang making me want to vomit. He lifted me up by the collar again, his face inches from mine. I could see the rage in his eyes, the veins bulging in his neck. "You shouldn't have come here," he snarled, spitting in my face. His breath stank of cigarettes and something sour. I knew this was it. I was going to die here, in this filthy warehouse, surrounded by broken people just like Mike. But then something unexpected happened. There was a loud crack, not from a gun, but from the pipe I'd dropped. Mike had somehow managed to crawl over, his hands still tied, and he used the pipe to hit the guy in the back of the head. It wasn't a hard hit, but it was enough to knock him off balance. He let go of me, stumbling forward, and I took my chance. I grabbed the knife that had fallen on the floor earlier, the one the first guy had been holding. My hand was shaking so bad I almost dropped it, but I held on. I didn't think. I just acted. I plunged the knife into the guy's side, right below his ribs. He let out this horrible scream, stumbling backward, blood pouring from the wound. I pulled the knife out and stabbed him again and again, until he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his hands clutching his side. Everything was chaos after that. The guy I'd hit in the knee was still writhing on the ground, screaming in pain. The one Mike had hit with the pipe was out cold, a pool of blood forming under his head, and the third one, the big one, was choking on his own blood, his eyes wide with shock as he realized he was dying. I dropped the knife, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was covered in blood, his blood. I could barely breathe, my ribs on fire, my head pounding, but I didn't have time to think. I rushed over to Mike, cutting the ropes that bound his wrists. His skin was raw, bloody, but he didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief.
"We need to get out of here," I whispered, but my voice was shaky, weak. Mike nodded, but he could barely stand. I threw his arm over my shoulder, supporting his weight as best I could, and we stumbled toward the door. Every step felt like I was dragging 100 pounds of dead weight, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We made it out of the warehouse, into the cold night air. My car was parked a block away, but it felt like miles. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting the other two guys to come after us, but they didn't. Maybe they were dead. Maybe they were too injured to move. I didn't care. I just wanted to get Mike out of there. We reached my car and I practically shoved him into the passenger seat. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition, but after a few tries, the engine roared to life. I floored it, driving as fast as I could away from that place, away from the nightmare. Mike didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring out the window, his body slumped against the seat. I kept glancing at him, half expecting him to pass out or worse, but he stayed conscious, his breathing shallow but steady. I didn't know where to go. The hospital was out of the question. They'd asked too many questions. The cops? They'd never believe us. So I drove, not really thinking, just trying to put as much distance between us and that warehouse as possible. It wasn't until we were miles away, far out of the city, that I pulled over. My hands were still shaking, my body aching from the beating I'd taken. I looked at Mike, and he finally looked back at me. His eyes were empty, hollow, like everything he'd been through had stripped away whatever was left of him. "We can't go back," I whispered, and he nodded. He knew. We both knew. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us saying a word. There was nothing left to say. We were both broken, haunted by what we'd seen, what we'd done. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. There were more of them out there. More warehouses, more trucks, more people being taken. But for now, we were alive. And that was all that mattered. I don't know what happened to the others. The ones I couldn't save. Maybe they're still out there, waiting to be found. Or maybe they're already gone. All I know is that the people behind this, they're still out there too. And they know I'm still alive. I don't sleep much anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, the men I killed, the ones I couldn't save. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel like someone's watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Because I know one thing for sure, you don't just walk away from something like this. They'll come for me eventually, and when they do, I'll be ready. I'll be